Hello, and welcome to the Redundancy Matters podcast, helping compassionate HR professionals managing redundancies who want to put people at the heart of the process. I'm your host, June Hogan, a qualified career coach and outplacement specialist with a background in HR and founder of outplacement services provider Wildwood Coaching. In this podcast, I'll be sharing my insights and experience from being on both sides of the redundancy table and from my years of experience supporting individuals after redundancy through outplacement support. Hello and welcome to today's episode of Redundancy Matters. I'm June Hogan, I'm a career coach and I'm an outplacement specialist and I've got a background in HR. So this podcast is all about helping HR professionals navigate redundancy with compassion and care and making sure that you put people at the heart of the process. So today I'm focusing on preparing line managers for redundancy consultation meetings. These meetings are probably one of the hardest things a line manager will have to do in their career. They're essentially having to tell good people, some of whom they will have worked with for a long time. Some will be friends inside and outside of work. And they're having to tell them that they potentially no longer have a future in the organisation and that their livelihood is at risk. So these meetings really do matter for the individual and they matter for the line manager. They're not just about following the rules, about following a process. They're about showing up as a leader and making those difficult decisions and having those difficult conversations with compassion. So this episode is designed to help you prepare your line managers for consultation meetings so they can lead well and also ensure that they follow a legally compliant process. So before we go into the detail, I just wanted to share with you some words that I think are particularly appropriate when we're talking about the role of a line manager in redundancy consultation meetings. And these words are taken from the Brené Brown book, Dare to Lead. I'll put a link to that in the show notes if you want to check it out. And essentially, Brené Brown talks to an individual who's got 30 years of leadership experience. And these are her reflections on when managers have the difficult conversations around firing employees. This is an American book, so they use the term firing and layoff. So I'll just read some of the words from there, which I think really resonate. The individual talks about always giving people a way out with dignity. So what does that really mean? So essentially she talks about remembering the human and pay attention to feelings. Of course, leaders must make thoughtful business decisions that are right for the company, lay people off, fire someone, or reassign a person to a different role. Definitely do what makes sense to achieve the company's goals. And while you're doing what you need to do, always hold the human in mind. Keep that person who will be impacted by your decisions squarely in front of you. This person has a career, a family, and a life that will be affected. When you're delivering the news, be kind, be clear, be respectful, and be generous. So I think those words are really pertinent when we're considering how line managers can support individuals in these difficult conversations and these difficult situations. So there's no getting away from it than that these are tough conversations. The employee will no doubt be feeling shocked, traumatized even, angry, confused, upset. And for the manager, it can also be an awkward situation. It can be emotional for them as well. I've heard from individuals who've said that, my line manager was crying when they had to deliver the news to me when they were in their redundancy consultation meeting. And also it can be unpredictable. So I've worked with line managers who, I thought would be fine in those meetings, and we'd done our preparation, and actually in that situation, it was a very, very difficult conversation for them. So I kind of had to take over. So you never really know what's going on for an individual in their life. So the person at the other end of the receiving the news. So it's hard to predict how they might react. And so it can feel a bit like going into the unknown. And line managers as well, if they've never had to do this kind of thing, it can be very difficult. They might be wondering, well, what if I get emotional? What happens if the individual starts to cry, or maybe they get angry? They could be thinking, well, but what if I say the wrong thing? Will that get me into trouble? Will that kind of, upset the process? How's that going to work? And they could just be feeling awkward and just thinking, do you know what? I just want to get on with it, kind of read the words that I have to say and just sort of get out of the room. And I've certainly been in those meetings where that's the approach that line managers have taken, unfortunately. But these meetings are a moment that will be remembered. They stay with people. People remember how they felt, and there's certainly an impact on self-esteem from these conversations, around confidence as well. And how these meetings are handled really does affect the individual's ability to kind of pick themselves back up again and start to think about the future and start to think about moving on. So it's highly likely that in the first meeting, when the individual hears the words, your role is at risk of redundancy, and I've talked about this in previous episodes, that they won't hear much else after that. But what they will remember is whether their line manager was present, whether they were treated like a person rather than something that was kind of, just a thing to tick off their to-do list. So that connection that a line manager is able to have in that meeting is hugely important, and that is one thing that will always stay with the individual. So in terms of talking about what to say, I think it's really important first to think about how to be in those meetings. So it's not just preparing for another meeting. Essentially, the line manager is helping to lead someone else, another human, if you like, through a deeply vulnerable time in their lives, a deeply vulnerable moment. And showing up as a human in these situations, I think, is really important. So maybe asking your line managers to pause and just ask, so what would it feel like if this was me in that situation? What would it feel like if I was on the other side of the table? What would I want my line manager to be doing for me? How would I want my line manager to show up? What would I need from them in that moment? Think about, well, how do I want this person to feel in this meeting? What is that lasting impression I want them to take away of how I showed up and how they felt during that conversation? And also think about, well, what does it look like to lead with dignity? What does it look like to lead with compassion in this situation? So helping line managers to think about their perspective. And yes, compliance is hugely important, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But also, how do they come at this conversation from a place of care and a place of wanting to do the right thing and the best thing for their team members? Thinking about the different reactions that could come in a consultation meeting. They can be unpredictable, as I've said, but really helping the line managers to connect with, essentially, when someone hears those words, your role is at risk of redundancy, it's not just their job that's at stake, it's not just their income, and that's why those reactions can be unpredictable and in some cases extreme. So I think it's helpful just to reflect on, well, what's actually in a job? What is it that is at risk? Because it's not just a job. So someone's self-esteem is at risk because our jobs and our self-esteem are often intertwined. Our jobs give us a sense of our place in society. They contribute to financial stability. Our jobs give us relationships that we rely on for support outside of our friendship groups, outside of work. Our jobs are very much connected to our identity. They give us a sense of purpose, a sense of meaning, and there will be a career for many people who see their jobs as a sense of hope, as an opportunity to progress and learn and develop, and in turn move through the organisation, take on extra responsibilities and have that kind of future focus, if you like. And for some people who have difficult personal lives, our jobs can be a sense of sanctuary, a place of escape, a place of comfort. So all of that is thrown into the mix when you say to somebody, your role is at risk of redundancy. All of that is what's at risk, which is what makes these meetings difficult conversations, and what makes these meetings important conversations to treat people in the right way and give them the respect and the space that they need. So the process matters, of course it does. These conversations are part of a legal framework, and I would always recommend, where possible, that the line managers have somebody from the HR team in the room with them or on the call, so that they will be there to help to guide them through the conversation. But if that's not possible, then I would always consider having someone else in the meeting, so another colleague, for example, so that there are two people. And if you're only a small HR team and you just don't have the resources to go around, then you can always bring in somebody externally temporarily. So there's lots of fabulous HR consultants out there who can kind of step in at short notice and allow you to get through the process and then have that really important HR support. So positioning the meeting with the line manager, because ultimately they will be leading the meeting. This is their meeting. It's not a HR meeting. And so here are a few things just to talk through with them before the meeting and to make sure they're fully prepared. So the meeting is a consultation meeting. It's not a final decision. It's an opportunity to explain the proposal, to hear feedback, to listen to what the employee has to say, and to give them the space to ask questions. It's about sharing information, but it isn't about decision making. So it's a professional meeting, somewhere quiet, somewhere confidential, and really importantly, turning all the distractions off. So for that length of time, for the length of the consultation meeting, the person squarely in front of you is the most important person in your world for the next 30 minutes, 40 minutes, however long you've got with them. And that clear focus and that attention and that ability to really make them feel important is hugely valuable in kind of setting up the meeting in the right way and holding that space for somebody. So the language that's used in that meeting is also important, and no doubt, preparing a line manager for the meeting does involve talking them through a script. Now, the script is important, but I would encourage line managers to prepare and rehearse to make it sound like them, but not going off-piste, because that's something that can lead to difficulties later down the line. But really making it sound like it's them delivering it. So not necessarily absolutely sort of sitting there with your head in the paper or your head sort of staring at the screen, taking breaks to look up, to make eye contact, making sure the information is delivered and making sure that it's delivered properly, but also in a way that shows that there's a connection being made with the individual. Active listening is hugely important. This isn't about listening to what the individual has to say and kind of listening to it through your own filter or passing judgment on that, but focused listening, maintaining that eye contact, and really importantly, listening with the intention to understand and not to respond. So it might be that the individual is asking questions that the line manager doesn't know the answer to. That's absolutely fine. It's much better just to listen, to take some notes, to record what the individual has said, and to say that you'll get back to them, rather than feel like, well, I'm the line manager in the room, therefore I should have all the answers, and kind of start making things up or maybe making commitments. That's really not helpful for anyone. So letting the line managers know what they kind of can and can't say. So everything is proposed. The language you use in the meeting is important. As I've just said, not making those promises and not bringing in personal opinions. I have had line managers in the past when I was managing redundancy consultations, and we'd done all the preparation, we got the script, we were there and we were going through it, and then suddenly they just completely went off script and started talking about how they didn't agree with the restructure, and if it was up to them this wouldn't be happening. And I remember just looking up thinking, oh my word, where did that come from? What's happening now? So you just be prepared for that and make that point ahead of the meeting that this isn't a place for personal opinions. Line managers need to be accountable and to take ownership for these decisions, and that's really important for the individual to hear that. And then really making them aware of what happens next. And individuals sometimes feel that the only time they can talk to their line manager about the proposed redundancy is in those consultation meetings. So it's super important for line managers to make themselves available outside of those meetings and to make that one of the points that they get across in the meeting itself. Because if the individual hasn't taken everything in, if they're in shock, or if their emotions have just got the better of them, as it were, and they're really not able to absorb the information, then having those discussions outside of the meeting will be really, really helpful. So one of the things that's important is just to really emphasise what's your intention for how you want to show up in the meeting, and to give line managers some space and some time to just think about that, to think about how do you want to be when you're in that room or you're on that virtual call. How do you want to show up? And what does that look like? What does that mean? What does that mean you have to do to kind of prepare yourself? Certainly running from one meeting to another I know it's not always possible to have some breathing space in between, but I think it's really important when you're in redundancy consultation meetings to build that into the timetable. So certainly, once they're timetabled, is to always make sure you've got at least 15 minutes in between each meeting, so that there's an opportunity to catch up on notes, but also to think about that intentional ability to focus and to show up and to be present and to not kind of be rushing from one thing to the next. And thinking about that mindset around, rather than this is something I have to do, it's kind of another thing on the list, but thinking, well, I get to lead this person through a really difficult and vulnerable time in their career. And it's my role as a leader to do that well, to be there for the individual and to support them through this. And so that perspective of this is a time to step up as a leader, I think is crucially important, as opposed to seeing it as a process and something to kind of tick off the list. And also, there's a lot of emotion that goes with these conversations for the line managers. They will be carrying the load of having to let good people go, of having to see people in emotional situations and having to do their best to support them. So they will also carry a lot of that. So making sure that line managers know they can come to you, they can reach out, just to talk about how the meetings have gone, how they're feeling, and just to provide a space for them to kind of offload. So I hope that's been helpful, just to give you some ideas and some things to think about before going into redundancy consultation meetings. Of course, there's all the procedural stuff that sits alongside that, all the things that you'll be preparing ready for the meeting. I'll put a link in the show notes to a free guide that I've got, which helps you to prepare for and conduct redundancy consultation meetings. You're welcome to download that as well. And just knowing that these meetings will never be easy. They should never be easy. I used to still get those kind of butterfly feelings in my stomach when I would go into those consultation meetings, even though I'd done, unfortunately, lots of them in the past. But it's about ensuring that the meetings are held with that compassionate approach and with that way to give people a way out with dignity, as I mentioned at the start. And also, as I say at the end of most of these podcasts, because I think this quote really resonates with the tone of managing redundancies, is by Maya Angelou. And she says that people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. So thank you for listening today, and I hope that this episode has been useful. And if you wanted to go deeper into all things redundancy, then host a free monthly redundancy lunch and learn with a colleague, where we explore different aspects of redundancy and best practice for supporting employees. And I'll also put a link to that in the show notes. And I hope you'll join me for another episode of Redundancy Matters sometime soon. Thank you so much for listening to the Redundancy Matters podcast. I hope you found today's episode helpful. It would mean a lot to me if you would follow, rate and review this podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts, as this helps it reach more people who are managing redundancies. Let me know what you thought, and if you have ideas for future episodes, I'd love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn, June Hogan, and get in touch via my website, wildwoodcoaching.co.uk, where you'll also find more resources to help you manage redundancies. I hope you'll join me again soon for the next episode of Redundancy Matters.